Lightning split the October sky like God's own fury as Alberto Uras's security system screamed its death throes, cameras going dark one by one as the storm of the century battered his fortress of marble and steel. But it wasn't the million-dollar damage that would haunt him. Hit that like button right now, smash subscribe, and whatever you do, don't skip any part of this story because every single second is absolute fire. Drop a comment telling us what you think is about to happen. Because this one's about to blow your mind, was what the darkness revealed when he stepped onto his porch at 3:47 a.m. and found his maid Keisha sleeping there with a baby, both of them shivering in the chaos, the child's steel-gray eyes opening to mirror his own in the lightning's flash. The storm hit Rosewood Heights like a beast awakening from centuries of slumber, tearing through the exclusive neighborhood with winds that screamed vengeance and rain that fell like bullets from heaven's own arsenal. Alberto Uras stood in his climate-controlled home office, watching his empire's stock prices dance across multiple screens while nature declared war on his perfectly ordered world. 35. Alberto was a predator in an Italian suit, 6'2" of calculated menace wrapped in custom silk and cruelty. His jet-black hair was slicked back with military precision, revealing sharp Mediterranean features that had graced magazine covers and inspired corporate nightmares. But it was his eyes, steel-gray and merciless as winter storms, that made billionaires stammer and competitors flee in terror. His mansion was a monument to conquest. 16,000 square feet of marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and furniture that existed to be admired rather than used. Persian rugs worth more than houses, art collections hanging like expensive ghosts, rooms that stretched endlessly without a single trace of human warmth. It was a mausoleum of success, beautiful and utterly lifeless, much like the man who ruled it with an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove soaked in poison. Lightning crashed outside his bulletproof windows, and Alberto's lips curved in something that might have been a smile if it held any warmth. He'd clawed his way out of Chicago's most brutal neighborhoods by learning one fundamental truth: mercy was a luxury that got you buried, and emotion was a weakness that rivals exploited without hesitation. His father's belt had taught him that tears accomplished nothing. His mother's overdose had taught him that love was just another word for betrayal wrapped in false promises. Now, surrounded by everything money could buy, he felt like a king ruling over a wasteland of his own creation. His phone buzzed against the mahogany desk, emergency alerts about power outages, fallen trees, flooding. The storm was already being called historic, a once-in-a-century event that would leave millions without power. Alberto deleted the messages with characteristic indifference. He had backup generators that could power a small city, security systems that could survive nuclear war, and enough supplies to outlast any disaster. What he didn't have was anyone to share it with, but that was a choice he'd made long ago. 23 floors below, in the mansion's industrial-grade kitchen, Keisha Washington was fighting her own war against time and circumstance. At 24, she moved through her cleaning routine with the desperate precision of someone who understood that perfection meant survival, that one mistake could cost her everything she couldn't afford to lose. The storm outside raged like her own personal hell given form, rattling windows and making the lights flicker ominously. But Keisha couldn't leave, not yet. Her shift wasn't over, and Mr. Uras had made it crystal clear that his standards were non-negotiable. Perfect or gone. No middle ground. No excuses. She was ethereally beautiful in the way that made people stop and stare, rich chocolate skin that seemed to glow from within, thick natural curls ruthlessly contained in a bun that had taken months to perfect, and a dancer's grace that poverty couldn't quite steal. Standing 5'6" with curves her modest uniform couldn't quite hide, she moved like liquid silk despite the exhaustion carved into every line of her delicate frame. But it was her eyes that told the real story. Deep brown with flecks of gold, they held a weariness that went soul deep, the kind that came from months of impossible choices and dreams deferred indefinitely. Yet even in her exhaustion, there was a strength that couldn't be broken, a dignity that disaster couldn't touch, and the corner, hidden behind commercial refrigeration units where prying eyes couldn't reach, 6-month-old Sophia slept fitfully in a carrier that had cost Keisha 2 weeks of grocery money. The baby was perfect, caramel skin that glowed like candlelight, delicate features that spoke of both parents' beauty, and when she was awake, the most startling steel-gray eyes that seemed to see straight through to people's souls. Lightning crashed again, closer this time, and the lights flickered more violently. Sophia stirred, making the small sounds that meant she was cold and uncomfortable and tired of living in shadows like a secret shame. Keisha abandoned her cleaning to check on her daughter, her heart clenching with familiar panic. The formula was almost gone. The eviction notice in her purse gave her 48 hours to find a miracle. The storm outside was getting worse, and her 15-year-old Honda might not survive the drive to the Walmart parking lot where they'd been sleeping since losing their apartment. "Sure, baby girl," Keisha whispered, stroking Sophia's cheek with fingers that trembled more than they should. "Mama's almost done. Just a little longer." But as if the universe had decided to test her resolve, the lights died completely. Emergency power kicked in a heartbeat later, bathing everything in an eerie red glow that made shadows dance like demons. And in that crimson half-light, Keisha heard the sound that would change everything: alarms. The security system was screaming like a wounded animal, alerts cascading through the mansion speakers in a symphony of electronic panic. Power surges from the storm had fried something vital, and the backup systems were failing one by one. Sophia began to cry, not the hungry wail that meant feeding time, but the terrified shriek of a baby who could sense her mother's fear. The sound echoed off marble and steel like an accusation, and Keisha felt her carefully controlled world beginning to crumble. She needed to get out. Now. Before Mr. Urus discovered her secret, before he learned that his invisible maid had been hiding a baby in his perfect, sterile world. But as she fumbled for her supplies in the emergency lighting, Sophia's cries grew louder, piercing the chaos like sirens in hell. The service door's keypad was dead, the electronic lock sealed tight by failing security protocols. Keisha's blood turned to ice water as realization crashed over her. She was trapped inside with a screaming baby and an employer who would destroy them both if he discovered her deception. And somewhere in the mansion's upper reaches, she heard the sound that made her soul try to flee her body. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, and moving through the darkness like death itself, coming to collect a debt she couldn't pay. Alberto Urus was awake, and he was coming. The storm outside roared its approval as two worlds prepared to collide in the most spectacular fashion, and neither Keisha nor Alberto could have imagined that this night of chaos and revelation would become the first chapter of a love story that would either save them both or destroy everything they thought they knew about family, forgiveness, and the price of a human heart. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the kitchen in stark white terror, and Sophia's cries seemed to echo with the voice of destiny itself, calling her father home through the darkness he'd wrapped around his soul. Like armor. The footsteps grew louder, each one echoing through the mansion like hammer blows against Keisha's racing heart. She pressed herself against the refrigeration unit, clutching Sophia desperately as the baby's cries pierced the emergency lighting's crimson glow. The security alarms wailed like banshees, but nothing could mask the sound of Alberto Urus moving through his domain like a predator hunting prey. "What the hell is going on down there?" His voice cut through the chaos like a blade through silk, cold and sharp enough to draw blood. The intercom crackled with static, but his fury came through crystal clear. "Someone better have a damn good explanation for why my house sounds like a war zone." Keisha's hands shook as she tried to quiet Sophia, but the baby seemed to sense the danger closing in around them. Her tiny fists waved in the air as her cries intensified, each wail a betrayal that would expose them both to the monster who signed Keisha's paychecks. The kitchen door exploded open with enough force to rattle the industrial-grade hinges, and Alberto Urus stepped into the red-bathed chaos like Satan emerging from his personal hell. His expensive pajamas, silk that cost more than most people's rent, hung perfectly on his imposing frame, but there was nothing civilized about the fury blazing in his steel-gray eyes. He moved with the predatory grace of someone who'd learned violence before he'd learned compassion, scanning the kitchen like a general surveying a battlefield. His gaze swept over overturned cleaning supplies, the emergency lighting casting demonic shadows across his sharp features, until it landed on the source of the crying. For a moment that stretched like eternity, Alberto simply stared. Keisha pressed herself deeper into the shadows, but there was nowhere to hide from those merciless eyes that had destroyed careers and crushed dreams with equal indifference. "You," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than screaming. "You're the cleaning woman." It wasn't a question. It was an accusation delivered with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Keisha forced herself to stand, clutching Sophia against her chest like a shield made of love and desperation. "Mr. Urus, I can explain." The word exploded from his chest like a gunshot. "Explain why there's a screaming baby in my kitchen at 4 in the morning? Explain why my security system is fried and my house is in chaos and you're here with a child I never authorized." His eyes raked over her with the cold assessment of someone cataloging assets for liquidation. "I pay you to clean, not to run a daycare center in my home." Sophia's cries reached a fever pitch, and something dangerous flickered across Alberto's face. Not sympathy, but irritation that someone so small could create such chaos in his ordered world. "Make it stop," he commanded, stepping closer with the casual authority of someone who'd never been denied anything. "Now." "She's scared," Keisha said, her voice stronger than she felt. "The alarms, the lights. She doesn't understand what's happening." "Neither do I." Alberto's composure cracked like ice under pressure. "I come downstairs to check my security system and find my maid running an unauthorized nursery in my kitchen. Do you have any idea what kind of liability issues this creates? What kind of—" "She needed somewhere safe," Keisha interrupted, and immediately regretted it when Alberto's eyes narrowed to deadly slits. "Did you just interrupt me?" His voice could have frozen hell itself. "In my house? While trespassing with an unauthorized person?" Lightning crashed outside, illuminating the kitchen in stark white terror for a split second, and in that flash, Sophia's eyes opened wide. Steel-gray eyes that should have been impossible, eyes that mirrored the man standing over them with perfect, damning clarity. But Alberto was too focused on his fury to notice the genetic echo staring back at him. "You're fired," he said with the casual cruelty of someone swatting a fly. "Effective immediately. Security will escort you out as soon as the storm passes." "Please," Keisha whispered, and the word tasted like ashes in her mouth. "I need this job." "She needs— I don't care what she needs." Alberto's mask of civility finally shattered completely. "You brought a baby into my home without permission. You've been lying to me for God knows how long. You think I built this empire by tolerating deception." He stepped closer, towering over her with all the menace of a cobra preparing to strike. "How long? How long have you been bringing that thing into my house?" "She's not a thing," Keisha said quietly, but her words carried a strength that made Alberto's eyebrows shoot up in surprise. "Her name is Sophia, and she's my daughter. I don't care if she's the Queen of England." Alberto snarled. "She doesn't belong here. You don't belong here. You're staff. You're supposed to be invisible." The words hit Keisha like physical blows, but she straightened her spine with dignity that poverty couldn't steal. "I've been cleaning your house for a year, Mr. Urus. A year of making your life comfortable while you never bothered to see me as human. And tonight, when I had nowhere else to go, that's not my problem." Alberto's voice echoed off the marble surfaces like thunder. "Your personal disasters don't give you the right to invade my privacy." Sophia had stopped crying, her steel-gray eyes now fixed on Alberto's face with an intensity that should have been impossible for a 6-month-old. She reached out one tiny hand toward him, and for a split second, something shifted in Alberto's expression. Confusion, recognition, something deeper than anger. But the moment passed like lightning, and his fury returned with doubled force. Get out, he said, his voice deadly quiet again. Both of you. Now. The storm, Keisha began. I don't care if it's the apocalypse. Alberto stepped back, as if proximity to them might contaminate him. You lied to me. You brought an unauthorized person into my home. You violated every term of your employment contract. He pulled out his phone, fingers flying over the screen with practiced efficiency. I'm calling security. They'll escort you to your car and make sure you never set foot on this property again. Mr. Urus, please, Keisha's voice cracked despite her efforts to stay strong. Just until morning. She's just a baby, and it's freezing out there. Should have thought about that before you decided to use my kitchen as a homeless shelter, Alberto said without looking up from his phone. Not my kid, not my problem. The words hung in the air like a curse, and if Alberto had been paying attention, he might have noticed how Sophia's tiny hand reached toward him again, as if some primal instinct recognized the man who'd contributed half her DNA. But Alberto Urus had spent 35 years perfecting the art of not seeing what he didn't want to acknowledge, and tonight would be no different. Security's on their way, he announced with satisfaction. They'll wait with you until the storm passes enough for safe travel. Then you're gone, and if I ever see you near this property again, I'll have you arrested for trespassing. Keisha clutched Sophia tighter, feeling her carefully constructed world crumbling around her like a house of cards in a hurricane. But even in her desperation, she held on to the dignity that was her birthright. You know what, Mr. Urus, she said quietly, her voice carrying a strength that made Alberto look up from his phone in surprise. Someday you're going to realize that all your money and power can't buy you the one thing you need most. And what's that? Alberto asked with a sneer that could cut glass. Keisha met his gaze steadily, Sophia quiet now in her arms as if sensing the importance of this moment. A heart that remembers how to love. The words hit their target like arrows finding their mark, and for just a moment, Alberto's mask slipped enough to reveal something that might have been pain. But it was gone so quickly Keisha might have imagined it. Save your philosophy for someone who cares, Alberto said coldly. Security will be here in 10 minutes. Use the time to figure out where you're going, because it won't be here. He turned on his heel and stalked toward the door, but Sophia chose that moment to make a sound. Not a cry, but a soft coo that seemed to call after him. Alberto froze mid-step, his hand on the doorframe, and for a heartbeat, Keisha thought she saw his shoulders tense with something that wasn't anger. But when he turned back, his face was the same mask of cold indifference it had always been. 10 minutes, he repeated, and disappeared into the darkness beyond the kitchen, leaving Keisha alone with her daughter and the wreckage of their only sanctuary. Outside, the storm raged with renewed fury, as if nature itself was protesting the cruelty that had just unfolded in the marble cathedral of Alberto's emotional wasteland. And in the emergency lighting's crimson glow, Sophia's steel-gray eyes seemed to shimmer with unshed tears for a father who didn't know he'd just cast his own child. Into the storm. The security guards arrived like harbingers of doom, their heavy boots echoing through the mansion's marble halls as the storm outside reached biblical proportions. Through the kitchen's floor-to-ceiling windows, Keisha could see trees bending at impossible angles, debris flying like missiles through the night, and rain so thick it looked like God had opened every faucet in heaven at once. "Ma'am, we need to get you to your vehicle," the lead guard said, his voice apologetic but firm. He was a mountain of a man with kind eyes that seemed genuinely sorry about the situation. "Mr. Urus's orders." Keisha clutched Sophia tighter, the baby now mercifully quiet but alert, her steel-gray eyes taking in everything with an intelligence that seemed far beyond her 6 months. "You can't seriously expect me to drive in this storm with a baby." Through the intercom, Alberto's voice crackled with static and irritation. "Not my problem, Rivera. Get them off my property. Now." Rivera winced, pressing his earpiece. "Sir, with respect, The National Weather Service is calling this a Category 2 hurricane. Sustained winds at 80 miles per hour. The roads are flooding, and there are reports of, "I don't care if it's the end of the world." Alberto's voice exploded through the speakers, with enough venom to kill a snake. "She lied to me, Rivera. She brought an unauthorized person into my home. She's gone. End of discussion." But as Rivera moved toward Keisha, a sound that made everyone freeze cut through the storm's fury, the groaning, splintering crack of a massive tree giving up its centuries-long fight against the wind. The impact, when it came, shook the entire mansion like an earthquake. Crystal chandeliers swayed dangerously, alarms that had finally quieted screamed back to life, and every light in the kitchen died as if someone had thrown a switch on the world itself. And the absolute darkness that followed, Sophia began to wail, not the frustrated crying from before, but the primal scream of a baby who sensed that something had gone terribly, catastrophically wrong. Emergency lighting flickered on and off like a dying heartbeat, casting everything in strobing red that made the kitchen look like a scene from hell. Through the chaos came the sound of running footsteps, and Alberto burst through the door like a man possessed. "What the hell was that?" he demanded, but his question was answered by the sight through the windows. A massive oak tree, easily 100 years old, had crashed down across the circular driveway, its trunk thick enough to hide a car behind. "Jesus Christ," Rivera breathed, speaking into his radio. "Base, this is Rivera. We've got a tree down blocking all vehicle access to the main house. Repeat, no vehicles in or out until we can get a crew with chainsaws." Alberto's face went through a series of expressions: fury, disbelief, and something that might have been panic before settling back into cold calculation. How long? In this storm? With these winds? Rivera shook his head grimly. "Minimum 12 hours, sir. More likely 24. That's if the crews can even get equipment out here before the hurricane passes." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Alberto's carefully controlled world, his perfectly ordered existence where problems could be solved with money and intimidation, had just collided with the one force that didn't care about his bank account: nature itself. "No," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "No, this is not happening. Call a helicopter. Call the National Guard. Call whoever you have to call, but get them off my property." "Sir," Rivera said carefully, "no aircraft are flying in this weather. The FAA has grounded everything within a 100-mile radius. We're completely cut off until the storm passes." Alberto's mask of control finally cracked completely. "Are you telling me," he said, each word dripping with barely contained rage, "that I'm trapped in my own house with an employee I just fired and her bastard child?" The words hit Keisha like a physical slap, and something dangerous flickered in her eyes. Not fear, but fury that burned as hot as Alberto's own. Sophia's cries intensified, as if she could sense the hatred radiating from the man who shared her DNA without knowing it. "Her name," Keisha said quietly, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade through silk, "is Sophia. And if you call her that again, storm or no storm, I'll show you exactly what this employee thinks of your money and your threats." Alberto turned on her with the speed of a striking cobra, stepping close enough that she could smell his expensive cologne and see the fury blazing in his steel-gray eyes. "You'll what? You're in my house, on my property, completely at my mercy. You think you're in a position to threaten me?" "I think," Keisha said, not backing down despite the fact that he towered over her like a storm cloud made flesh, "that this storm just made us equals. Your money can't fix this, your power can't change it, and your cruelty can't make it go away. For the next 24 hours, we're all just people trying to survive." The standoff stretched between them like a wire pulled to its breaking point, both of them breathing hard, neither willing to give an inch. Sophia's cries filled the space between their fury, and for a moment, something shifted in Alberto's expression: confusion, as if the sound stirred something deep in his subconscious that he couldn't quite identify. But the moment passed, and his walls slammed back into place with almost audible force. "Fine," he said, stepping back and straightening his silk pajamas with movements sharp enough to cut glass. "Fine. You want to play this game? Here are the rules. You and your daughter can stay in the service quarters until the storm passes. You don't leave that area. You don't speak to me unless spoken to. And when this is over, you disappear forever." The service quarters. Keisha's eyes widened in disbelief. "Those rooms haven't been heated in years. There's no furniture." "No, not my problem," Alberto cut her off with surgical precision. "You wanted equality? Congratulations. You're equally screwed." Rivera cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Sir, with respect, those quarters aren't habitable. No heat, no running water, and with this cold front moving in behind the storm. Then maybe next time she'll think twice before lying to her employer," Alberto said with the casual cruelty of someone stepping on an ant. "Rivera, escort them to the service wing. Post a guard if necessary." "Mr. Urus," Rivera said carefully, "I have to advise against—" "You have to follow orders," Alberto snapped. "That's what I pay you for. Not to give me moral guidance." But as if the universe had decided to weigh in on the conversation, another massive tree crashed down somewhere in the distance, and the mansion's remaining power grid finally gave up the ghost. The emergency lighting died with the electronic wheeze, plunging them all into a darkness so complete it felt like being buried alive, and that absolute blackness. Sophia's cries took on a different quality, not just fear, but desperate need. The temperature was already dropping as the mansion's climate control failed, and without power, the service quarters would become a death trap within hours. "Sir," Rivera's voice came through the darkness, professional but strained, "I'm going to have to override your orders. Federal emergency protocols require me to ensure the safety of all persons on the property during a natural disaster. I can't in good conscience put a baby in an unheated room during a hurricane. You work for me." Alberto's voice cracked like a whip in the darkness. "I work for a security company with federal contracts," Rivera replied calmly. "And right now, those contracts supersede your personal preferences. The woman and child stay in the main house where it's safe." The silence that followed was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. When Alberto finally spoke, his voice carried the promise of retribution that would make careers disappear and lives crumble. "When this storm is over, Rivera, you're done. Not just with me. With everyone. I'll make sure you never work security again." "I understand, sir," Rivera said without a trace of fear. "But I sleep better knowing babies don't freeze to death on my watch." And in that moment, standing in the darkness with his daughter crying in her arms and two men fighting over her fate, Keisha felt something shift inside her chest. Not gratitude, she was too proud for that, but recognition that even in Alberto's world of money and cruelty, there were still people who remembered what it meant to be human. "The guest wing," Rivera continued, "has a fireplace and battery backup lighting. It's the safest place in the house until power is restored." "Absolutely not," Alberto snarled. "I don't want them anywhere near my living space." "Then you'll have to explain to the authorities why you let a baby die of exposure during a natural disaster," Rivera said flatly. "Your choice, sir." The standoff stretched through the darkness like a living thing, and Keisha found herself holding her breath, waiting to see which side of Alberto Urus would win, the businessman who understood liability, or the monster who'd rather see them suffer than admit he might be wrong. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who'd just been forced to swallow broken glass. "Guest wing. But I want a guard posted. And when this storm is over, all of you are gone." As Rivera led them through the darkened mansion toward temporary sanctuary, Keisha couldn't shake the feeling that this storm had set something in motion that none of them could control. And somewhere in the darkness behind them, Alberto Urris stood alone with his fury and his pride, not knowing that the baby crying in the distance carried his own eyes and his own stubborn determination to survive against impossible odds. The storm outside raged with renewed fury, but the real tempest was just beginning inside the mansion's marble walls. The guest wing felt like stepping into a tomb of luxury, Persian rugs worth small fortunes, art that belonged in museums, and furniture that no one had touched in years. Rivera had managed to get a fire crackling in the massive stone fireplace, its light dancing across walls lined with first-edition books that probably cost more than most people's houses. But it was still a prison, and Alberto Urris made sure they knew it. "Motion sensors," he announced, standing in the doorway like a warden delivering rules to inmates. His silk pajamas had been replaced by dark jeans and a black sweater that made him look even more dangerous in the firelight. "One step outside this wing, and alarms will wake the entire neighborhood, what's left of it." Keisha sat cross-legged on the Persian rug, Sophia finally quiet in her arms as the baby stared up at the flickering shadows on the ceiling. "You're really going to keep us under surveillance like criminals?" "You are criminals," Alberto said coldly. "Trespassing, fraud, breaking and entering. I could have you arrested the moment this storm passes. For cleaning your house and trying to keep my daughter warm." Keisha's voice carried a strength that made Alberto's jaw tighten was foreign to him. Sophia made another sound, not quite words, but something that sounded almost like she was trying to communicate. Her eyes never left Alberto's face, and when he crouched down to her level without seeming to realize what he was doing, she reached out again, this time managing to brush her tiny fingers against his hand. The effect was electric. Alberto jerked back as if he'd been struck by lightning, his eyes wide with something that looked suspiciously like panic. "She's warm," he said, staring at his hand like it had betrayed him. "She's a baby," Keisha said gently. "That's what they do. They're warm and soft, and they trust people until they learn not to." "Trust is stupid," Alberto said, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. "Trust gets you hurt." "Love gets you hurt too," Keisha said quietly. "But we do it anyway, because the alternative is being alone forever." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge neither was ready to cross. Outside, the storm raged with renewed fury, but inside the guest wing, an odd sort of peace had settled over them. Sophia was content in her mother's arms, the fire crackled warmly, and for the first time in a year of working in this house, Keisha saw Alberto Urris without his armor. He looked younger somehow, more human. And there was something in the way he kept glancing at Sophia, not with a calculating assessment of a businessman, but with a confused wonder of someone encountering magic for the first time. "She has unusual eyes," he said suddenly. Keisha's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "The color. It's distinctive." Alberto was studying Sophia's face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a mystery. "I've only seen eyes that color a few times." "Gray eyes aren't that uncommon," Keisha said carefully, but her voice sounded strange even to her own ears. "Steel gray," Alberto corrected. "Like storm clouds. Like—" He trailed off, his brow furrowing as if he was chasing a memory that refused to be caught. Sophia chose that moment to yawn, a tiny perfect sound that seemed to break whatever spell had been weaving itself around them. Alberto stood abruptly, as if suddenly remembering who he was supposed to be. "The fire should last through the night," he said, his voice back to its usual cold formality. "There are blankets in the chest by the window. Don't touch anything else." He was almost to the door when Sophia made another sound, not a cry, but something softer, almost like she was calling after him. Alberto's hand froze on the doorframe, and for a moment, Keisha thought he might turn around. Instead, he spoke without looking back. "Guard rotation changes at 6 a.m. Try not to burn the house down before then." The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Keisha alone with her daughter and 1,000 questions she wasn't sure she wanted answered. But as she settled back against the Persian rug, Sophia warm and content in her arms, one thought kept circling through her mind like a prayer or a curse. Steel-gray eyes weren't that common. And the way Alberto had looked at Sophia, the way he'd instinctively moved to protect her from the storm's sound, the way recognition had flickered across his face. Outside, lightning illuminated the guest wing's windows, and in the brief flash of white light, Keisha could have sworn she saw a figure standing in the hallway beyond the door. Watching. Waiting, as if Alberto Urris couldn't quite bring himself to walk away from the mystery that was Sophia's existence, even when every instinct he possessed was screaming at him to run. The storm outside began to quiet slightly, but the tempest building inside the mansion's walls was just getting started. Dawn crept through the guest wing's windows like a thief apologizing for breaking in, painting everything in shades of gold and amber that made the previous night feel like a fever dream. Sophia had slept peacefully through the storm's final hours, but Keisha had spent the night wide awake, replaying every moment of Alberto's strange behavior around her daughter. The way he'd looked at Sophia. The way he'd said steel-gray eyes, like he was solving a puzzle. The way he'd instinctively moved to protect her from the storm's noise. She was still lost in thought when she heard it. Piano music, hauntingly beautiful, drifting through the mansion's walls like a ghost singing lullabies. The melody was complex, melancholy, played with a kind of skill that spoke of years of training and a soul that understood heartbreak on an intimate level. Sophia stirred at the sound, her steel-gray eyes opening to focus on something beyond the ceiling, as if she could see the music floating through the air. And then, impossibly, she smiled. Not the random expressions babies made, but a real, genuine smile that seemed to recognize something in the melody. "You hear it too, don't you, baby girl?" Keisha whispered, stroking Sophia's cheek. "Someone's awake early." The music stopped abruptly, as if the player had suddenly remembered they weren't supposed to be human. Silence fell over the mansion like a blanket, but Sophia continued to stare toward the source of the sound, her tiny hand reaching out as if she could touch the lingering notes. Keisha made a decision that would have horrified her cautious side. She wrapped Sophia in a blanket and slipped out of the guest wing, following the faint scent of coffee and something else, something that smelled like grief and memory mixed together. The mansion felt different in the morning light. Less like a mausoleum and more like a sleeping giant, full of rooms that held secrets and hallways that whispered stories. She followed the scent and her instincts through passages she'd cleaned but never really explored, until she found herself standing outside a room she'd never been allowed to enter. Through the partially open door, she could see Alberto sitting at a massive grand piano, his fingers still resting on the keys as if he'd forgotten how to move them. He wore the same dark jeans and sweater from the night before, but somehow he looked smaller in the morning light, less like a predator and more like a man who'd forgotten how to be anything else. "I know you're there," he said without turning around, his voice carrying none of its usual edge. "Your daughter makes noise when she breathes." Keisha stepped into the doorway, Sophia quiet but alert in her arms. "I'm sorry. I heard the music and you decided to ignore my rules about staying in the guest wing." Alberto's fingers moved across the keys again, picking out a melody that was softer, sadder than before. "This song. She was smiling when you walked in." "Why?" "I don't know," Keisha said honestly. "She's never heard piano music before." Alberto turned on the bench, and Keisha's breath caught at the expression on his face. The mask was gone completely, replaced by something raw and vulnerable that made him look like a different person entirely. His steel-gray eyes were tired, haunted, but there was something else there, a confusion that went bone-deep. "My grandmother taught me to play," he said suddenly, as if the words were being pulled from him against his will. "Sophia Magdalena Urris. She's the only person who ever—" He stopped, shaking his head. "Why am I telling you this?" "Because sometimes secrets get too heavy to carry alone," Keisha said softly, stepping into the room despite every instinct that told her she was walking into dangerous territory. The piano room was like stepping into a different world, warm where the rest of the mansion was cold, lived in where everything else was pristine. Sheet music was scattered across the bench and floor, some pieces so worn they looked like they'd been played 1,000 times. Photo frames sat on the piano's surface, but they were turned face down, as if the memories were too painful to look at directly. "She named you after her grandmother," Keisha observed, her voice carefully neutral. "My mother named me after my grandmother's favorite opera singer," Alberto corrected, his fingers still moving absently across the keys. Sophia was different. She saw good in people, even when there wasn't any to find. Sophia made a soft sound, almost like she was responding to her name, and Alberto's hand stilled on the keys. "She died when I was 12. Heart attack. One day she was teaching me Chopin, the next day she was gone, and I was alone with parents who saw me as an investment opportunity rather than a person." "Is that when the music stopped?" Keisha asked gently. Alberto's laugh was bitter as winter coffee. "That's when everything stopped. My father made it clear that piano was for people who could afford to be weak. He preferred other teaching methods." The way he said it, the slight tremor in his voice, told Keisha everything she needed to know about Alberto's childhood. Her heart clenched with unexpected sympathy for the small boy who'd been taught that love was a luxury and kindness was a liability. "I'm sorry," she said simply. "Don't." The word came out sharper than intended. "I don't need pity. I survived. I won. That's what matters." "Did you?" Keisha asked quietly. "Win, I mean? Because from where I'm sitting, you look like a man who's been at war so long he's forgotten what he was fighting for." The words hit their target like arrows finding their mark. Alberto's mask flickered, and for a moment, Keisha saw something that looked like despair in his steel-gray eyes. "Some wars don't end," he said finally. "Some fights, you either win or you disappear." Sophia chose that moment to make another sound. Not quite words, but something that sounded almost musical, as if she was trying to join the conversation in her own way. Both adults looked at her, and in the morning light streaming through the piano room's windows, her resemblance to Alberto was unmistakable. The same sharp cheekbones. The same determined chin. The same steel-gray eyes that seemed to see straight through to people's souls. "She's beautiful," Alberto said suddenly, and there was something in his voice that made Keisha's chest tighten with warning bells. "Her features, they're very distinctive." "She gets that from her father," Keisha said carefully, watching his face for any sign of recognition. "And where is he? The father?" Alberto's voice was casual, but there was an undertone of something dangerous. Not threat, but hunger for information that went deeper than curiosity. "Gone," Keisha said again, but this time the word carried weight. He made it clear that he wasn't interested in being responsible for the consequences of his actions. Something flickered across Alberto's face. Guilt, recognition, something that made him turn back to the piano as if the keys could provide answers to questions he wasn't ready to ask. "Men like that deserve to suffer," he said quietly, and the venom in his voice was directed inward rather than at some absent father. "Maybe," Keisha said. "Or maybe they just don't know how to be anything other than what the world taught them to be." Alberto's hands found the keys again, picking out a melody that was achingly beautiful and infinitely sad. "My grandmother used to say that music was the language the heart spoke when words weren't enough." Smart woman. She was. His voice was soft, distant. "She used to tell me that someday I'd find someone who would make me want to be better than my worst impulses. Someone who would see past the walls I'd built and love me anyway." Sophia made another musical sound, and Alberto's playing stopped abruptly. When he looked at the baby, His expression was a mixture of wonder and terror that made Keisha's blood run cold. "How old did you say she was?" he asked. 6 months. 6 months, Alberto repeated, and this time Keisha heard the calculation in his voice, saw the moment when pieces of a puzzle started clicking into place in his brilliant, ruthless mind. That would make her birth. March. Late March, Keisha said, her mouth suddenly dry as desert sand. Alberto stood from the piano bench slowly, like a man walking to his own execution. When he turned to face them, his steel-gray eyes were blazing with something that might have been recognition, might have been horror, might have been hope. "There's something you need to see," he said, his voice strange. He walked to the photo frames on the piano, hesitating for a moment before turning one around. The photograph showed a young woman with kind eyes and gentle smile, holding a baby who couldn't have been more than a few months old. But it was the baby's eyes that made Keisha's world tilt dangerously off its axis. Steel gray, identical to Sophia's, identical to the man standing beside her. "Sophia Magdalena Urus," Alberto said quietly. "My grandmother. And that baby she's holding, that's me." The resemblance was undeniable, devastating in its clarity. The same eyes, the same bone structure, the same expression of quiet determination that Sophia wore like a crown. "Oh God," Keisha whispered, clutching Sophia tighter as the implications crashed over her like a tsunami of realization. 6 months ago," Alberto continued, his voice deadly quiet, "there was a night. A party. Too much whiskey and not enough sense. A woman who stayed late to clean up after my tantrum." His steel-gray eyes locked onto hers with laser intensity. "Tell me I'm wrong, Keisha. Tell me that baby isn't mine." The silence that followed was so complete it felt like the world had stopped breathing. Sophia made a soft sound and reached toward Alberto, and in that moment, the truth became as undeniable as gravity. "I was going to tell you," Keisha whispered, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. "When?" Alberto's voice cracked like a whip. "When she graduated college. When I was on my deathbed. When exactly were you planning to mention that I have a daughter?" And in the piano room filled with music and memories and the ghosts of a better man's dreams, 3 lives collided with the force of destiny finally claiming its due. The storm outside had passed, but the real tempest was just beginning. The word daughter hung in the air between them like a live wire crackling with enough electricity to burn down everything they thought they knew about their lives. Alberto stared at Sophia with the intensity of a man trying to memorize every detail of a miracle he'd never believed in, while Keisha held her breath, waiting for the explosion that would either destroy them all or somehow, impossibly, save them. "She's mine," Alberto whispered, and the words came out like a prayer torn from the throat of a man who'd forgotten how to believe in anything good. "She's actually mine." Sophia, oblivious to the magnitude of the moment, chose that instant to reach toward Alberto again, her tiny fingers opening and closing as if she was trying to grab hold of something just beyond her reach. This time, Alberto didn't pull away. He extended one finger, and when Sophia's impossibly small hand wrapped around it with surprising strength, something shattered inside his chest. "Oh God," he breathed, dropping to his knees beside Keisha as if his legs had forgotten how to support him. "Look at her. Look at those eyes. How did I not see it before?" "Because you weren't looking," Keisha said softly, her voice thick with tears she was trying not to shed. "You never really looked at either of us." Alberto's free hand moved toward Sophia's face, stopping just short of her cheek as if he was afraid his touch might somehow break her. Is it okay if I?" "She's your daughter," Keisha said, and the words felt like stepping off a cliff into empty air. "You don't need permission to touch your own child." The sound Alberto made when his palm finally made contact with Sophia's cheek was somewhere between a sob and a sigh of relief. His hand was so large it covered half her face, but his touch was infinitely gentle, like he was handling spun glass and starlight. "She's so warm," he marveled, his voice cracking with wonder. "So perfect. Look at her little nose, her tiny ears. Did she have complications? The birth? Is she healthy?" The rapid-fire questions tumbled out of him like water through a broken dam, and Keisha realized she was seeing Alberto Urris without any masks for the first time. Not the ruthless businessman, not the cruel employer, but a father meeting his daughter and falling in love at light speed. "She's perfect," Keisha assured him, unable to keep the smile out of her voice. 8 pounds, 2 ounces. Born at 3:47 in the morning after 14 hours of labor that I mostly spent thinking about how much I was going to hate you for the rest of my life. 3:47. That might have been guilt flickered across his features. "The same time I found you on the porch last night. That can't be a coincidence." "The universe has a twisted sense of humor," Keisha agreed, watching as Sophia began to make soft cooing sounds, her steel-gray eyes fixed on Alberto's face with the kind of complete attention babies reserved for the most important people in their world. "She likes me," Alberto said, and there was such naked wonder in his voice that Keisha felt her heart clench with an emotion she wasn't ready to name. "She actually likes me." "She loves you," Keisha corrected gently. "That's what babies do. They love without conditions, without reservations, without caring about your bank account or your reputation or how many people you've crushed to get where you are." Alberto's laugh was shaky, broken. "She doesn't know what a monster her father is." "Maybe," Keisha said quietly, "she sees something in you that you've forgotten exists." Sophia chose that moment to release Alberto's finger and reach for his face instead, her tiny palm pressing against his cheek with the blind trust of someone who'd never learned that the world could be cruel. Alberto closed his eyes and leaned into her touch, and in that moment, Keisha saw the boy he'd been before life taught him that love was a weakness and kindness was a liability. "I don't know how to do this," he whispered, his voice so quiet it was barely audible. "I don't know how to be a father. I don't know how to be anything other than what I am." "Nobody knows how to be a parent," Keisha said, shifting slightly so Alberto could see Sophia better. "You figure it out as you go, one day at a time, one mistake at a time. What if I mess her up?" The vulnerability in his voice was devastating. "What if I turn her into someone like me?" "You won't," Keisha said with absolute certainty. "Because you're already worried about it. My father never worried about messing me up, and he did it anyway. The fact that you care means you're already better than him." Alberto opened his eyes, steel-gray meeting steel-gray as father and daughter stared at each other across the divide of 6 months and a lifetime of missed moments. "Tell me about her," he said suddenly. "Everything. From the beginning." So Keisha told him. About the pregnancy test that had turned her world upside down, about working 3 jobs while carrying his child, about the nights she'd lain awake wondering if she should contact him and the mornings she decided she was better off raising Sophia alone. She told him about the labor, about the first time Sophia had opened her eyes and looked at her with those impossible steel-gray irises that had made Keisha's heart stop with recognition. "You were alone," Alberto said when she finished, and there was something in his voice that sounded like self-hatred. "For all of it. The pregnancy, the birth, everything. You were completely alone." "Not completely," Keisha said, looking down at Sophia. "I had her. But no one to help you. No one to support you. No one to tell you that you were doing a good job or that everything would be okay." Alberto's voice was getting stronger, angrier, but the anger wasn't directed at her. "How did you survive? How did you manage?" "The same way you survived your childhood," Keisha said simply. "One day at a time. One choice at a time. One breath at a time." Alberto was quiet for a long moment, processing everything she'd told him. When he spoke again, His voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. I want to change her diaper. What? Keisha blinked in surprise. I want to feed her. I want to hold her. I want to. He stopped, shaking his head as if he couldn't believe the words that were coming out of his mouth. I want to be her father. Really be her father. Not just the guy who contributed DNA. Keisha studied his face, looking for any sign of the cruel man who'd tried to throw them out into the storm just hours earlier. But all she saw was raw honesty and a desperate hunger to connect with the daughter he'd never known existed. She needs a bottle, Keisha said finally. And her diaper probably needs changing. Show me, Alberto said. Immediately. Show me how to take care of her. For the next hour, Keisha found herself in the surreal position of teaching a billionaire how to change diapers and warm formula. Alberto approached fatherhood with the same intense focus he brought to hostile takeovers, asking detailed questions about everything from the correct temperature for bottles to the best way to burp a baby. Support her head, Keisha instructed as Alberto held Sophia for the first time, his massive hands dwarfing her tiny frame. She's stronger than she looks, but her neck muscles are still developing. Like this. Alberto's voice was tense with concentration, as if he was defusing a bomb rather than holding his daughter. Relax, Keisha said gently. She can sense if you're nervous. Just breathe. As if she understood the conversation, Sophia made a contented sound and snuggled closer to Alberto's chest, her tiny fist tangling in his sweater. The effect on Alberto was immediate and devastating. His entire body relaxed, and his face transformed into something Keisha had never seen before. Pure, unconditional love. She's so small, he marveled, his voice soft with wonder. How is she so perfect? Look at her little fingers, her tiny toes. She's like a miracle. She is a miracle, Keisha agreed, watching as Sophia's eyes began to drift closed in her father's arms. Your miracle. Our miracle, Alberto corrected, and when his steel-gray eyes met Keisha's, she saw something there that made her breath catch in her throat. Not just love for Sophia, but something deeper, more complex. Gratitude, respect, and maybe, just maybe, the beginnings of something that looked like love for her too. Keisha, he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight of emotion she'd never heard from him before. I'm sorry. For last night, for the way I treated you, for not knowing about Sophia. I'm sorry for all of it. You didn't know, she said simply. I should have known. The guilt in his voice was painful to hear. I should have paid attention. I should have seen you as a person instead of just staff. I should have remembered that night, should have checked on you, should have. Alberto, Keisha interrupted gently, using his first name for the first time in the year she'd worked for him. You can't change the past. But you can choose what happens next. He looked down at Sophia, who was now sleeping peacefully in his arms, her tiny face relaxed and trusting. What happens next, he said slowly, is that I figure out how to be the father she deserves. And the man you both deserve. The words hung in the air between them like a promise, and for the first time since that night 6 months ago, Keisha allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, this impossible situation might somehow work out. Outside the piano room's windows, the storm had passed completely, leaving behind a world washed clean and bright with possibility. But inside, 3 people who'd been strangers just hours before were learning what it meant to be a family, one heartbeat at a time. Sophia stirred in Alberto's arms, making soft baby sounds that seemed to say everything words couldn't express about love, hope, and second chances that arrived disguised as hurricanes. The bliss lasted exactly 47 minutes. Alberto was sitting on the piano bench with Sophia cradled against his chest, humming the melody his grandmother had taught him 30 years ago, when the first phone call came. Then the second. Then the third, fourth, and fifth, until his cell phone was buzzing like an angry wasp trapped in a jar. Don't answer it, Keisha said softly, watching as something cold and familiar began to creep back into Alberto's expression. Whatever it is, it can wait. But Alberto was already reaching for the phone, and the moment he saw the name on the screen, his face transformed back into the mask of ruthless calculation she knew too well. It's my board of directors. Something's wrong. The call lasted less than 3 minutes, but by the time Alberto hung up, the gentle father who'd been learning to change diapers had vanished, replaced by the predator who'd built an empire on other people's broken dreams. What is it? Keisha asked, though the ice forming in her stomach already knew the answer wouldn't be good. Pictures, Alberto said, his voice deadly quiet. Someone took pictures last night. Of you on my porch. Of me bringing you inside. Of us in the guest wing together. His steel-gray eyes had gone from warm to arctic in the space of a heartbeat. They're calling it Billionaire's secret baby mama drama, and it's trending on every social media platform in existence. The words hit Keisha like a physical blow. Pictures? But how? Who? Paparazzi with telephoto lenses, probably. Or maybe one of my neighbors decided to make some quick cash. Alberto stood abruptly, Sophia still in his arms, but his body language completely changed. It doesn't matter who. What matters is that my competitors now know I have a weakness they can exploit. A weakness. Keisha's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. Is that what Sophia is to you? A weakness. She's a liability. The words exploded from Alberto's chest with enough force to make Sophia startle awake. Don't you understand what this means? Every business rival I've ever made, every competitor I've crushed, every enemy I've accumulated over the years, they all now know exactly how to hurt me. As if summoned by his rising panic, Rivera appeared in the doorway, his face grim. Sir, we have a problem. Multiple problems, actually. How bad? Alberto demanded, automatically swaying to soothe Sophia even as his world began to crumble around him. Channel 7 news trucks are setting up outside the gates. TMZ is offering $100,000 for an exclusive interview with the mystery woman and the secret baby. And Rivera hesitated, his expression growing even darker. Victor Castellanos is here. The name hit Alberto like a sledgehammer to the solar plexus. Victor Castellanos, his most ruthless competitor, the one man who'd come closest to destroying everything Alberto had built, the predator who'd been circling Alberto's empire like a shark for 3 years waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. He's here? Now. Alberto's voice dropped to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than screaming. Pulled up in a convoy of black SUVs about 10 minutes ago. Says he's here to discuss mutual business interests and congratulate you on your new family situation. The threat was clear. Castellanos hadn't come to congratulate, he'd come to destroy, and now he had the perfect ammunition to do it with. Get security to escort him off the property, Alberto ordered, but Rivera was already shaking his head. He's not technically trespassing, sir. He's standing on the public road just outside your gate, giving interviews to every reporter who'll listen. And what he's saying. Rivera's expression grew even grimmer. It's bad. They could hear it even from inside the house, the distant sound of voices, camera crews, the chaos of a media feeding frenzy in full swing. Alberto moved to the window, still holding Sophia, and his face went chalk white at what he saw. Dozens of news vans, hundreds of reporters, crowds of curiosity seekers all pressed against his gates like an invading army. And there, in the center of it all like a spider in his web, stood Victor Castellanos, 6 feet of polished menace in an expensive suit, speaking into microphones with the practiced ease of a man who lived to destroy his enemies in public. What's he saying? Keisha asked, Though part of her was afraid to know, Alberto's jaw was clenched so tight it looked like it might shatter. He's questioning my fitness to run a billion-dollar corporation, suggesting that a man who can't even take care of his own employees' basic needs shouldn't be trusted with shareholders' money, implying that I've been running some kind of sweatshop where desperate women are forced to hide their children just to keep their jobs. Each word was like a nail in the coffin of everything Alberto had spent his life building. "He's turning you into the villain," Keisha said softly. "I am the villain." Alberto, night, one stupid moment of weakness. I've handed my enemies exactly what they need to destroy everything. Sophia began to cry at the sound of raised voices, and Alberto's face twisted with something that looked like pain. But instead of comforting her, he held her out toward Keisha like she was a bomb about to explode. "Take her," he said, his voice cold as winter wind. "Take her and get out of here. Both of you." "What?" Keisha stared at him in disbelief. "You heard me. This is over. Whatever fantasy we were living for the past few hours, it's done. I can't afford to have a family. I can't afford to have weaknesses that my enemies can exploit." "She's not a weakness." Keisha's voice cracked with fury and heartbreak. "She's your daughter. She's a liability that's going to cost me everything I've worked for." Alberto's mask of cruel indifference was back in place, but Keisha could see the cracks around the edges. "I'll set up a trust fund. Financial support. Whatever you need. But I can't. I won't let them use her to destroy me." The words hit Keisha like bullets, each one finding its mark with devastating precision. So what was all that? The diaper changing, the humming, the promises about being the father she deserves? Was it all just an act? "It was a mistake," Alberto said, but his voice wavered just slightly. "A moment of weakness that I can't afford to repeat." Keisha took Sophia from his arms, and the moment the baby left his embrace, something died in Alberto's eyes. But he didn't reach for her again, didn't take back the words that were destroying the fragile family they'd started to build. "You're a coward," Keisha said quietly, her voice carrying more venom than any scream. "I thought you were a monster, but you're worse than that. You're a coward who's too afraid of losing his precious empire to fight for the people who love him." Love. Alberto's laugh was bitter as poison. "You don't love me. You barely know me. And she's a baby. She loves everyone who feeds her and changes her diapers. Don't romanticize this into something it's not." "You're right," Keisha said, cradling Sophia closer as tears began to flow down her cheeks. "I don't love you. I love the man you were for 47 minutes this morning. The man who held his daughter like she was made of starlight and promises. But that man was apparently just visiting, wasn't he?" The accusation hit its mark. Alberto flinched as if she'd slapped him, but his voice remained steady. "That man was a luxury I can't afford." Outside, the media circus was growing louder, more chaotic. Castellanos was still giving interviews, still feeding the frenzy that was already beginning to tear Alberto's carefully constructed world apart at the seams. "Rivera will escort you out," Alberto said, turning away from them toward the window where his empire was burning in real time. "There's a service entrance that leads to the old carriage house. From there, you can slip away without the media seeing you." "And then what?" Keisha demanded. "I go back to sleeping in my car? Back to choosing between formula and rent? Back to being invisible while you pretend we never existed?" "I'll take care of the financial arrangements," Alberto said without turning around. "Sophia will never want for anything. But I can't. I won't risk everything I've built for a family I never asked for." The cruelty of the words was breathtaking, designed to cut deep and leave scars that would never heal. But as Keisha stood there holding their daughter, Watching the man who'd held them both just minutes earlier transform back into the monster she'd always known he was, she realized something that made her heart break and her spine straighten at the same time: was lying. Not about sending them away, he was definitely doing that. But about not caring, about it being easy, about Sophia being just a liability. She could see it in the rigid set of his shoulders, the way his hands were clenched into fists at his sides, the careful distance he was maintaining between himself and them. Alberto Urris was less fatherless, didn't make their future any less uncertain. "Come on, baby girl," Keisha whispered against Sophia's head, breathing in the sweet scent that had somehow become home over the past 6 months. "Let's go. We're not wanted here." As Rivera led them toward the service entrance, Keisha didn't look back. She couldn't bear to see if Alberto was watching them leave, couldn't risk seeing regret or relief or anything else in his steel-gray eyes that matched their daughter's perfectly. But she could hear the piano music that started the moment they left the room, the same melody Alberto had been humming to Sophia, played now with a violence that spoke of a man trying to kill his own heart with his bare hands. Outside, the media circus raged on, and Victor Castellanos continued his campaign to destroy Alberto Urris one carefully chosen word at a time. Inside, a billionaire sat alone at his grandmother's piano, playing lullabies for a daughter who was already gone and a family he'd chosen to sacrifice on the altar of his own fear. And somewhere between the mansion and the waiting world, Keisha Washington held their daughter close and whispered promises that sounded like prayers and felt like war cries all at once. 3 days, that's how long it took for Alberto Urris to realize he was dying from the inside out. The first day, he told himself it was relief. The media storm was already beginning to calm now that the mystery woman and secret baby had vanished without giving any interviews. Castellanos had retreated to plan his next attack. The board of directors had scheduled an emergency meeting for the following week, but Alberto's lawyers were confident they could spin the situation into a positive, something about work-life balance and personal growth that would appease the shareholders. The second day, he tried to return to his normal routine. Hostile takeovers, corporate restructuring, the systematic destruction of anything that stood in the way of profit. But the numbers on his screens kept blurring together, and he found himself staring at the guest wing's empty fireplace instead of quarterly reports. By the third day, Alberto understood that he wasn't dying, he was already dead. He was just a corpse that hadn't figured out how to stop moving yet. The piano room had become his prison. He sat there for hours, his fingers finding the same melody over and over again, the lullaby his grandmother had taught him, the one that had made Sophia smile with recognition she shouldn't have possessed. Every note felt like a knife twisting in his chest, but he couldn't stop playing it. "Sir." Rivera's voice cut through the music like a lifeline he didn't deserve. "There's something you need to see." Alberto's hands stilled on the keys. "If it's another reporter, it's not." Rivera stepped into the room holding a tablet, his expression unreadable. "It's about Keisha and Sophia." The names hit Alberto like physical blows. He'd forbidden anyone from mentioning them, had threatened to fire anyone who brought him updates about their whereabouts or well-being. But Rivera had never been one to follow orders that endangered innocent people. "I don't want to know," Alberto said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Yes, you do." Rivera set the tablet on the piano bench, the screen showing a grainy cell phone video. "This was posted 2 hours ago. It's already gone viral." Against his better judgment, Alberto looked. The video showed Keisha sitting in what appeared to be a homeless shelter, Sophia in her arms, being interviewed by a local news reporter. But it wasn't an expose or a tell-all seeking revenge. It was something infinitely worse. "The father isn't in the picture," Keisha was saying, her voice steady despite the exhaustion carved into every line of her face. "But that's okay. Sophia and we're a team. We don't need anyone who doesn't want to be here." The reporter leaned forward. "But surely you have some feelings about his abandonment?" Some anger toward the man who left you and your daughter homeless. Keisha's smile was sad but genuine. I can't be angry at someone for being exactly who they've always been. He's not a bad man, he's just a scared one. And scared people make choices that protect them instead of the people they love. Even though those choices hurt you. Even then. Keisha looked down at Sophia, who was making soft cooing sounds and reaching toward the camera with tiny hands. Because someday, when he's ready to stop being scared, we'll still be here. Love doesn't have an expiration date. The video ended, but Alberto couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't process the fact that Keisha Washington, the woman he'd thrown out into a storm, the woman he'd abandoned when she needed him most, was defending him to the world. She's not asking for money, Rivera said quietly. Hasn't given any interviews except this one. Hasn't said anything negative about you or the company. She's working 3 jobs and staying in shelters, but she won't take charity and she won't sell her story. 3 jobs. The words came out like a croak. Cleaning office buildings at night, serving coffee in the morning, data entry in the afternoon. She's trying to save enough for an apartment deposit, but with childcare costs. Rivera shrugged. It'll take months, maybe longer. Alberto's hands were shaking. And Sophia? Healthy. Happy, from what I can tell. But she's been asking for you. What? Alberto's head snapped up. She can't talk. She's 6 months old. She reaches toward men with dark hair, Rivera said gently. Cries when they walk away. The shelter workers think she's looking for someone specific. The words hit Alberto like a sledgehammer to the chest. His daughter, was looking for him. Missing him. And he'd thrown them both away because he was too much of a coward to fight for what mattered most. Where are they? He asked suddenly. Sir. Where are they staying? Which shelter? Rivera hesitated. Mr. Urus, I don't think, where? Alberto's voice cracked like a whip, but underneath the command was desperation so raw it was painful to hear. Sacred Heart on 5th Street. But sir, the media attention. Alberto was already moving, grabbing his keys with hands that shook like leaves in a hurricane. Cancel my meetings. All of them. Cancel everything for the rest of the week. Sir, the board meeting. Fuck the board meeting. The profanity exploded from Alberto's chest with enough force to rattle the windows. Fuck the shareholders. Fuck Castellanos. Fuck all of it. I've spent my entire life building an empire, and for what? So I could die alone in a mansion full of things I don't care about. He was at the door when Rivera's voice stopped him. What do I tell them? The board, the lawyers, the press. Alberto turned back, and for the first time in 3 days, his steel-gray eyes held something that looked like hope. Tell them Alberto Urus is learning how to be a man instead of just a monster. Tell them I'm going to fight for my family, and if they don't like it, they can find another CEO. And if they fire you. Alberto's smile was sharp enough to cut glass, but there was something else there, something that looked suspiciously like joy. Then I'll have all the time in the world to spend with my daughter. The drive to Sacred Heart took 23 minutes, but it felt like 23 years. Alberto's mind raced through everything he wanted to say, everything he needed to apologize for, everything he had to make right. But when he finally stood outside the shelter's doors, watching through the window as Keisha bounced Sophia on her lap while talking to other mothers in similar circumstances, words suddenly seemed inadequate, pulled out his phone and made a call that would either save his soul or destroy his empire. Possibly both. Jonathan? It's Alberto. I need you to liquidate the Morrison account and transfer the funds to Sacred Heart Shelter on 5th Street. No, not a tax write-off. A donation. Anonymous. How much? All of it. Every penny. Yes, I know how much money that is. Yes, I'm sure. And Jonathan? Set up trust funds for every single mother in that building. Full college tuition for their kids, housing allowances, whatever they need. Because I can afford it, and they deserve better than sleeping on cots and hoping for miracles. When he hung up, his hands were steady for the first time in 3 days. Alberto Urris had spent his entire life accumulating power and wealth, and now he was about to find out if any of it mattered when weighed against love. Through the window, Sophia suddenly looked up, her steel-gray eyes scanning the room as if she sensed something. When her gaze found him, she smiled with pure, uncomplicated joy and reached toward the glass with both tiny hands. His daughter knew he was there. Despite everything, despite his cowardice and cruelty and complete failure as a father, she was happy to see him. Alberto Urris took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and walked through the doors to claim the only empire that had ever really mattered, the one measured in laughter and lullabies and the weight of a perfect little girl who carried his eyes and his stubborn determination to love against all odds. It was time to stop being scared and start being the man his family deserved. What moment in your life made you realize what truly mattered most? Share below how love changed your priorities. Sometimes the smallest hands hold the biggest pieces of our hearts. Silence in the sacred heart shelter was the kind that came before miracles or disasters, and nobody was quite sure which they were about to witness. Every conversation had stopped mid-sentence when Alberto Urris walked through the doors, his expensive suit and commanding presence completely out of place among the worn furniture and second-hand hope that filled the room. But he only had eyes for two people. Keisha sat frozen on a plastic chair that had seen better decades, Sophia cradled in her arms, both of them staring at him like they were seeing a ghost who'd forgotten he was supposed to be dead. The baby made a soft sound, not quite a word, but something that sounded suspiciously like recognition, and reached toward him with the same trust she'd shown 3 days ago in his piano room. "Hi," Alberto said, and the word came out rougher than he'd intended, like it had been scraped across broken glass before reaching his throat. "Hi," Keisha replied carefully, her voice carrying none of the warmth that it held when she defended him to reporters who didn't deserve her grace. Alberto looked around the shelter, at the cots lined up like surrendered dreams, at the mothers holding children who deserved better than this kind of uncertainty, at the walls that had absorbed more tears than paint. When his gaze returned to Keisha and Sophia, something had shifted in his expression. "I made a mistake," he said simply. "Which one?" Keisha's voice carried a strength that hadn't been there 3 days ago, as if surviving his rejection had forged something unbreakable in her spine. "Throwing us out or showing up here now?" "Both." "Neither." Alberto moved closer, but stopped just outside arm's reach, as if he understood he'd lost the right to casual proximity. "The mistake was thinking I could choose between loving you and protecting what I've built. The mistake was believing that fear was stronger than what we had for those 47 minutes. Sophia made another sound, more insistent this time, her tiny hands opening and closing as she tried to grab hold of something just beyond her reach. When Alberto extended one finger, she latched onto it with surprising strength, and the effect was immediate. His carefully controlled composure cracked like ice under spring sunshine. "I've been thinking about what you said," he continued, his voice thick with emotions he was finally allowing himself to feel. "About being a coward. You were right. I've spent my entire life being afraid of poverty, afraid of weakness, afraid of caring about anything more than I cared about winning. And when I found out about Sophia, when I realized I had something worth losing, I did what cowards do." "You ran," Keisha said quietly. "I ran," Alberto agreed. "But not from you. From myself. From the possibility that I might actually be capable of being the kind of man who deserved a family like you." One of the other mothers in the shelter cleared her throat pointedly. "Excuse me, but this is a private facility." If you're not here for services, actually, Alberto said, turning to address the room while keeping one hand connected to Sophia, I am here for services. Just not the kind you're thinking. He pulled out his phone and made a call that everyone could hear. Jonathan, it's Alberto. I need you to purchase the building at 247 5th Street. Yes, the entire building. I don't care what it costs. Because I'm going to turn it into transitional housing for families. Free rent, childcare services, job training programs. No, not a tax shelter. A home. Keisha's eyes widened as the implications of what he was saying began to sink in. Alberto, what are you doing? Something I should have done years ago, he said, ending the call and focusing entirely on her. I spent my whole life building an empire, and for what? So I could die alone and rich. So I could have the biggest headstone in the most expensive cemetery. He crouched down so he was at eye level with Sophia, who immediately reached for his face with both hands. When her tiny palms pressed against his cheeks, Alberto closed his eyes and leaned into her touch with the reverence of a man receiving communion. I don't want to be rich, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I want to be Sophia's father. I want to be the man who teaches her to play piano and reads her bedtime stories and scares away the monsters under her bed. I want to be the man who deserves Keisha Washington's love, even though I know I haven't earned it yet. Alberto, Keisha started, but he shook his head. Let me finish. Please. He stood slowly, Sophia's hand still reaching for him, her steel-gray eyes never leaving his face. I know I don't deserve a second chance. I know I hurt you in ways that can't be fixed with money or grand gestures. But I also know that 3 days without you felt like 3 years, and I won't, spend the rest of my life wondering what would have happened if I'd been brave enough to fight for us. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box that made every woman in the shelter hold her breath. But instead of dropping to one knee, Alberto sat down on the floor beside Keisha's chair, cross-legged like a child, and held the box out to Sophia. Sophia Magdalena Uris, he said formally, his voice carrying the weight of promises and hope and every dream he'd never allowed himself to have, would you like to come home with your daddy? The baby made a sound that might have been agreement, might have been joy, might have been the universe itself approving of love stories that started with storms and ended with families. When Sophia's tiny fingers closed around the ring box, Alberto looked up at Keisha with eyes that held everything he'd never learned how to say. The ring isn't for you, he said softly. I mean, it is, but not the way you think. It's a promise. To Sophia, to you, to myself. A promise that I'll spend every day for the rest of my life trying to become the man you both deserve. A promise that I'll never run again, never choose fear over love, never forget that the only empire worth building is the one we create together. Keisha was crying now, tears flowing freely down her cheeks as she looked at this man who'd learned how to be human in the space of 3 broken days. What about your company? Your board of directors? Everything you've worked for. Alberto's smile was soft, genuine, completely free of the cruel edges that had defined him for so long. Let me tell you a secret about empires, Keisha. The only ones worth having are the ones you can share with the people you love. Everything else is just expensive loneliness. He opened the ring box, revealing a diamond that caught the shelter's fluorescent lighting and threw rainbows across the walls like hope made visible. Keisha Washington, will you marry a reformed monster who's still learning how to be a man? Will you? Moment to reach for the ring, her tiny fingers drawn to the light like a moth to flame, and when Keisha gently guided her daughter's hand away, she was smiling through her tears. Only if you promise me something, she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. Anything. Promise me that when Sophia asks about how we met, you'll tell her the truth. That her father was a man who forgot how to love until a storm brought his family home to him. Alberto's answer came in the form of a kiss, gentle, reverent, full of promises that tasted like second chances and felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering in the wilderness. When they broke apart, Sophia was clapping her tiny hands together as if applauding the performance, and every woman in the shelter was crying tears of joy for a love story that had started with cruelty and ended with grace. 6 months later, the Sacred Heart building had been transformed into the Sophia House, transitional housing for single mothers that came with child care, job training, and the kind of support that turned temporary setbacks into permanent success stories. The grand opening featured a ribbon-cutting ceremony where a certain 6-month-old girl, now walking and babbling dada with increasing frequency, served as the honorary mayor. Alberto and Keisha were married in the piano room where their love had first taken root, with Sophia as the flower girl and Rivera as the best man who'd never let his boss forget the importance of protecting innocent people. The ceremony was small, intimate, and featured a lullaby that Alberto played for his girls while promising to love them through every storm that might come. But perhaps the most beautiful moment came later that evening, when Alberto found himself back on the marble porch where this story had begun. Only now, instead of standing there as a cruel billionaire discovering an unwanted complication, he sat with his wife and daughter, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of hope and possibility. "Do you ever regret it?" Keisha asked, Sophia sleeping peacefully in her arms after a long day of being the center of attention. "Giving up the empire for us?" Alberto considered the question seriously, looking out over grounds that now featured a playground instead of manicured gardens, listening to the sound of children's laughter instead of the silence of perfect isolation. "I didn't give up an empire," he said finally. "I traded a kingdom of fear for an empire of love. Best business decision I ever made." Sophia stirred in her mother's arms, her steel-gray eyes opening to find her father's face. When she smiled, that perfect, uncomplicated expression of pure joy, Alberto felt his heart expand with a kind of wealth that could never be measured in bank statements or stock portfolios. The storm that had brought them together was long past, but the family it had created would weather every tempest that life could bring. And on quiet evenings when the wind picked up and rain began to fall, Alberto would sit at his grandmother's piano and play lullabies for his girls, remembering the night when everything changed and love conquered fear one heartbeat at a time. In the end, Alberto Urris learned that the only empire worth building was one measured in laughter, lullabies, and the perfect weight of a little girl who carried his eyes and his capacity for love. Some storms, it turned out, really were worth dancing in. If this story touched your heart, hit that subscribe button, because every family deserves a love story this beautiful. If this story touched your heart, hit that subscribe button, because every family deserves a love story this beautiful.